Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to continue our conversation number 3 with Nish on the topics of spiral dynamics and his diamond model. So for those who are new, I'm going to link first to conversation in the description of this video. I would also like to introduce all the guests today for the new listeners. So everyone who has watched first 2 conversations, they must be already familiar with Nish. He's a student and practitioner of spiritual traditions for over 30 years. And he has written some best-selling books like Dancing with Angels and Unity of Everything. And today we also have more guests joining us today. Murtagh, she is a devoted student of consciousness and the reality of one mind. She's also a partner at the Collective Edge. We also have today with us Dr. Sally Jones. She's an expressive art therapist, author, transformative educator, and student of the sacred. She's also deeply interested in all models of human development and cross-cultural ways to understand reality. And then we have Steve Todd. He has a PhD in string theory, and has worked in finance and as a software entrepreneur. And he has also practiced Tibetan Buddhism for nearly 30 years. And then we have Veronica Polo. She's an organizer of spiral dynamics online events based in Spain. She's also a spiritual seeker, city planner, and sustainability advocate. And we also have Michael Spade. He's a long-term student and practitioner of traditional Eastern and neo-shamanic traditions. He has founded multiple small businesses to bring transformational understanding and technologies to support the emergence of meta-modern organizations. And last not but the least, we have Beth Bolhofer, who followed her mother's footsteps in becoming a yoga teacher, studying her mom's favorite Kundalini teacher, Kia Miller, and received her certification in Radiant Body Yoga. And before becoming a yoga teacher, she was a tech leader for 23 years. We have quite an impressive group here today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm deeply grateful that you all committed to this conversation. I think it's going to be exciting. Nish, I'm going to let you take the lead from here, and we'll start with our first topic today, which is atheism and scientific materialism, and how your diamond model applies to those topics.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Suma. Thank you for inviting me back for a third conversation. So I will begin by sharing the screen for this. There we go. Okay, so those of you who have seen my first 2 conversations with Suma will already have some familiarity with what I call the diamond model. However, I'll just very quickly in a couple of minutes run through it again, just for new viewers, and just to help orient all of us to this particular perspective and way of looking at things. So the diamond model is an attempt to try to get to the absolute essence of what the different spiritual traditions around the world are saying, with nothing important left out and also nothing superfluous left in. And it's also been found to have applications in other areas as well that are not spiritual, which is surprising, and also I found that quite exciting. So I'll quickly run through the different elements of this diamond model just to give a quick overview. So if we begin from multiplicity, that's the easiest place to begin, which is just 2 levels up from the bottom there, multiplicity. By multiplicity here, what I mean is the world of separate things in 3-dimensional space, separate events in 4-dimensional time. So this is the world in which we normally live, what we call the world of separate things, the world of parts, multiplicity. Most of the spiritual traditions, in different ways, assert that this world of multiplicity is not the ultimate reality. There's something else beneath the surface that we don't normally see, perceive, even conceive, usually, that represents a deeper, truer order of reality, some kind of underlying wholeness, oneness, unity, of which this world of multiplicity is a manifestation or a creation or an appearance of some kind. And I've just referred to that there as the whole. In the East, that's often talked of as emptiness or consciousness. In the West, that's often spoken of as God or the Godhead. Now, when the different spiritual traditions are analyzing what's actually wrong with the world, why do we suffer? Why do we kill each other, blow each other up? Why do we have internal conflicts? Most of them seem to come up with an analysis that the root cause of this is that our perception of the world, our perception of multiplicity has somehow become divorced from our perception of the whole. We've lost touch with this underlying wholeness, and we actually think that these different parts really are absolutely separate, and therefore we can identify with one part and go to war with another part. When you just have different parts that are all absolutely separate, and that separation is the absolute truth, then almost without fail, those different parts are going to bang into each other. And that's essentially what we call suffering. And when we do that, when we lose sight of the whole, what I'm calling that here in this model is the fragmentation. The different parts that make up multiplicity become fragments, divorced from each other, divorced from the underlying whole, and we fall from multiplicity into fragmentation. Different traditions call that illusion or sin in the Western traditions. Now, most of these traditions talk about an intermediate level between the whole and multiplicity, which represents what they refer to as like a subtle domain, which is more unified than multiplicity, but not quite as unified as the whole. And what I'm suggesting in this model is that that first manifestation, that first split, that first multiplicity that occurs in the subtle domain, as the whole is manifesting as multiplicity, is that fundamental or primary dualism between the subject and the object. What I mean by this is that we create a sense of separate selfhood within ourselves, as me, as this body, as this mind, and we see the rest of the world as objective, as object, as not me, as separate from me. And in a way, that's the first creation of parts. Creating me as a separate self is the first part that we create in each moment, as well as historically. And then that first split that we make then proliferates, and the subject continues to make more and more distinctions and parts in the object, as well as more and more distinctions and parts within itself, within the subject. And that's how subject and object together interact to produce this world of multiplicity. So we have this essential process whereby the whole becomes subject and object, becomes multiplicity, and then can become fragmentation. And I've referred to that entire process there as creation. The whole creates the part, creates the fragments. And we are invited in the spiritual traditions to reverse this process, to kind of reverse engineer this creation process, thereby to deal with the problem of fragmentation. And we can refer to that by the term evolution there on the right, whereby the fragments become parts and then they go back into the whole. So we rediscover that wholeness again. And essentially the whole of the spiritual practice, spiritual life, can ultimately be seen as this movement back to wholeness from this fragmentation in which we find ourselves. It's a kind of healing of divisions that are not necessary. Now, the ultimate insight in these traditions, in many of the traditions though, and that's referred to as enlightenment, full enlightenment, is that there is ultimately no difference or distinction ultimately between the whole and multiplicity. The whole and multiplicity are really two sides of the same coin that always arise together and fall together. And that insight or experience, we refer to that as non-duality. There is a non-dual relationship between the whole and multiplicity, as well as between subject and object. So the diamond, if we want to specifically talk about the diamond, which I'm suggesting lies at the absolute heart of reality, are effectively these two dualisms, the whole and the part. That's the vertical dualism, and the subject and the object, which is the horizontal dualism. Those are the two fundamental distinctions that we create in every moment of our experience. And when we engage in evolution, we can see that and eventually deconstruct that and see through that. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to the diamond model. And what I'm now going to do is to see how, if or how, that diamond model can shed any insight into what we could call scientific materialism or atheism. In other words, what we would normally regard as a completely non-religious, non-spiritual approach to reality. So here is a rather complex diagram which shows how this might actually happen or be seen. So I'm going to start by just referring to a famous equation that was put forward by Albert Einstein, which is that E equals mc squared. I'm saying this very tentatively when we have a PhD in physics in the audience today, so I'll be very careful. But Einstein's equation was E equals mc squared, which effectively seems to suggest or demonstrate that all matter that has mass is ultimately a form of energy. That matter with mass m contains or can be transformed into energy, the amount of which can be measured as m, the mass, multiplied by the square of the speed of light. And the essential insight from that, which actually led to the creation, for example, of nuclear weapons, is that energy and matter are effectively interchangeable. All matter can become energy. So bearing this in mind, my suggestion here is that this underlying wholeness in the diamond model is represented by this E. It's this basic pure energy before that energy takes any kind of form. It's the potential for work, the potential for the creation of form, pure energy lying at the heart of, or underneath, or at the foundation of, however you want to conceive it or picture it, behind manifestation. Now, as the universe evolves, eventually what we see evolving and being created through that process of evolution is the arising of sentient life, sentient consciousness, starting with very early life and eventually evolving into, as far as we know, the most advanced form of life we're aware of, which is us, human beings. And when that emergence of sentience occurs through this process of universal evolution, what we see is a potential split between subject and object. And I've denoted this here by agency on the left, which is the subject. That is the capacity of the sentient consciousness of the sentient subject to act and to observe. And that can happen even at very early stages of evolution where, even one-celled organisms are effectively responding to stimuli. That's still a kind of agency happening there. So there's the agency which acts and observes. An example of that is human consciousness. And what is actually being observed, which is the object, is existence, what we can just call existence. which, if we want to see it in a particular way, is effectively just information which is being observed and interacted with by that agency. So we have here in the subject-object, that subtle domain, agency, acting and observing and interacting with existence, which we can think of as consisting of various forms of information. And as a result of that interaction between agency and existence, we create our perception or our experience of reality, which corresponds to multiplicity. You can see that just 2 levels up from the bottom. So reality, which is the world as we know it, is the world of multiplicity, as spoken of in general terms in the diamond model. And that experience of reality results from this interaction between agency and existence. Now, science doesn't typically deal primarily with suffering, or certainly not with sin, but the error, if you like, in the scientific atheistic context is ignorance, getting our facts wrong. So when we believe or act in ways that actually conflict with multiplicity, which is a manifestation of energy, when we act and believe in ways that conflict with the world as we know it, to the best of our knowledge, given our level of development, we effectively divorce ourselves in our belief systems, in our action, from reality, to the best that we know it, and we fall into ignorance. And in the scientific materialist context, 2 very obvious examples that scientists and materialists would give of that kind of ignorance would be religious beliefs and bigotry, different kinds of bigotry, racist bigotry or sexist bigotry. And these would be analyzed not as sin or as causing suffering, but simply as manifestations of ignorance arising from failing to see the world as we can truly observe it and know it. And that entire non-dual oneness between energy and reality, between E and M in Einstein's equation, is simply the non-dual universe at the top there. So the universe is simply E and M, energy and matter. The process whereby energy manifests as reality, I'm just using a very general term there, the term of creation, and the process whereby reality can return to its state of energy, its primordial state of energy, and the use of nuclear weapons is an example of that, where mass is converted into energy, very destructive energy. And this will probably happen at the end of time as the universe gradually, the universe of matter gradually dissolves again back into some form of energy similar to what it was at the beginning. That's certainly one theory. I've referred to that process there as destruction. So we have this process of creation and destruction between energy and reality, and we are agents acting and observing that existence, and we can act in harmony with reality, which we would refer to in the scientific context as facts, or we can act and believe in ways that contradict reality, which the scientist would simply refer to as incorrect ignorance or superstitions. So that's a very quick summary of how the diamond model might be applied to understanding atheism and scientific materialism.
Does anyone have questions before we move on to the next topic?
I could try a question here.
I've maybe got a question after you, Beth, as well. Yeah.
I'm not taking any questions from Steve because he's a professional physicist. So
yeah.
Okay.
So I'm wondering where personality comes in. Like, how do we get personality as an agent, as an observer? Where does that come in? How does it play? Values, creation.
I would say that personality, values, creation, these all fall into the domain of multiplicity. So we have our primordial sense of self, which is subject, and our primordial sense of other, which is object. And then when we proliferate distinctions in the subject and in the object, we fall into multiplicity. And specific types of personality, specific values are effectively parts that are being created by the subject or by the culture of which the subject is a part. So because we're dealing with parts there rather than with the whole or with a primary dualism, that would be one of the features of multiplicity on the subjective side of multiplicity.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I've got a question, Nish, but it's not technical. It's more sort of
Okay.
loose and a bit speculative.
Okay, good, good.
So one thing that's interesting in your presentation there is that from the kind of scientific viewpoint, whether atheist or not, reality would actually be down at the bottom of the diamond just before ignorance, right? So they kind of see it on the whole there. But that's still kind of including a kind of atomistic or anatomistic prejudice, which is kind of our mode of thinking. You know, we tend to see things in parts. But if you look at, say, in physics, the urge, you know, the movement towards grand unified theories, that's clearly in the direction of wholeness, right? I think intuitively physicists know that the universe is just one thing. It's not many things. It manifests as many things, but it's only one. So there's a kind of interesting thing there in terms of even within the scientific community, there's already a kind of strong prejudice to still want to see things in terms of parts and mechanisms rather than, I think this is just an imaginative problem. It's just hard to imagine how the wholeness operates, you know, because we're bringing this prejudice of a subjective viewpoint. So I thought if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, that's a really excellent excellent point. I think that as we evolve, there is a sense in which, because we're moving towards wholeness in our perception and experience, we're going to start developing more holistic understandings of multiplicity. And I think essentially that's happening in science, especially with the movement towards like quantum theory is the obvious example there. So in quantum theory, we found that some of our really reductionist assumptions from Newtonian physics don't really hold at the atomic level. And I think that's an example of evolving perceptions of multiplicity. As we evolve, and if I just bring in spiral dynamics briefly, as we evolve from orange to green, which I think is what's happening with quantum physics, our perception of multiplicity, I mean, we don't return purely to wholeness, because there are still separate parts in a sense, but they're seen to interact and in ways that we wouldn't have seen in an atomistic Newtonian worldview. So as we evolve, we move towards wholeness, and we interpret multiplicity in ever more holistic terms as we do that. So I think that's what's happening. It's a growing intuition of wholeness within multiplicity.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
And one, sorry,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Quick reflection to give to you, Nish, is I see such beauty in this model. The way you can describe it in so few words, so clearly. I think it's going to be revolutionary. There's so many people out there trying to capture the perennial philosophy right now with so many words. And there's different languages. Most of them are speaking about eros as evolution. And what I love about your model is that you're not ignoring entropy. In fact, you're naming creation and destruction as principles, the binary principle that existed before humans. So we are fractals of that, and managing our energy becomes essential. And I'm really grateful that you're giving us this beautiful, elegant map of the split from unity to binary to multiplicity. I think it's gorgeous. Thanks, Nish.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And one of the things I wanted to test with the diamond model is it actually applicable to things outside of the spiritual traditions? Because if it's going to be taken seriously at all, it has to be able to address the dominant paradigm of our time, which is scientific materialism. So I felt I couldn't just ignore that. I had to try to accommodate that somehow. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
One thing I wanted to ask Nish, so just so we understand more clearly, what would it look like if scientific materialism starts growing out of its like rigid structure and getting more into understanding the non-dual aspects, because we have seen a lot of application, real life applications of scientific, the things that have come out of scientific materialism. I'm just wondering what that vision would look like once we start growing out of it.
I mean, I think we've already seen some step in that direction with what Steve mentioned earlier, which is that this very, very dualistic, entirely dualistic and reductionist Newtonian version of science was already significantly challenged by Einstein and overturned largely at the atomic level by quantum physics. And I think with the development of more and more exploration into what's truly fundamental, like string theory, for example, is what some people believe is the most fundamental thing. I think that's the direction which science will go. And the paradox here, I think, is that as we go to more and more fundamental things, we will actually discover the greater and greater wholeness, which sounds a bit paradoxical, because you'd think that as you go to more and more fundamental things, you'd actually get more and more separation because you're going to smaller and smaller things. But I think what is being found, and what will probably continue to be found, is that as we move more and more to the most basic building blocks, if you like, what we'll probably discover there is wholeness. So wholeness will be discovered to be the fundamental building block, not parts. And so I think that's probably how science may continue to develop. And I think maybe amazing applications will come from that. Maybe in the realm of medicine, or in the realm, all kinds of areas would probably be able to create applications which we can't even dream of now, because we'll discover interconnections that we can't even visualize or think of now.
I have a question regarding that quickly, Nish. This movement from E to M and M back to E is so elegant, that creative and creation and destruction. Are you suggesting that E is fundamental and is not created then?
Yes, I think so. I would suggest that as within the scientific context, as far as we can tell from science at the moment, sticking strictly to that context, energy seems to be without beginning and without end. It seems to be fundamental and primordial. Now, some of the spiritual traditions may go deeper and say that energy is a manifestation of consciousness, or energy is part of the radiance of consciousness. That's the Hindu view. But that, I think, goes way beyond what science can talk about at the moment. In the scientific context, energy, I think, is probably would probably be seen as eternal. It's always been there, and it always will be there. And there will be this endless interaction between energy and matter, energy and manifestation. So even the quantum potential, which is said to be the primordial state before the Big Bang, correct me if I'm wrong on that, Steve, but that quantum potential is essentially a state of energy prior to the Big Bang. And the Big Bang would be the beginning of the creation of matter, whereby E becomes M.
Yeah. I mean, the Big Bang has lots of technical problems with it, so it's, yeah.
Ready to move on to the sorry.
I have one more on this one. So I really like your hope about, as we evolve, we'll be able to basically see more and more of the whole. That's a very hopeful kind of view. And I've been really listening to a lot of things by Daniel Schumachtenberg. Do you know him? I might be saying his name wrong. Okay. So he has this thing that he's talking about called the third attractor. And basically it's just about how our current love of orange is driving us to destroy the planet. I mean, it's just that simple. And so this wholeness, what we're getting green and yellow and turquoise and beyond, where we start understanding externalities of when we pollute rivers, we have to take that into account in the cost of our products. So I think that it's like imperative that as we evolve, we have to really start seeing that bigger picture and figuring out how to mitigate all those externalities that are happening as we're, hopefully evolving this atheistic view. So I don't know if that was a question or just more like an imperative, and I'm glad that you have that hope.
Well, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and there are no guarantees in this game. Remember that
Okay.
creation and destruction, it's not merely a cyclical process that happens over billions of years. It's also a moment-to-moment process. And if we're not careful, the destruction will become more powerful than the creation, or the destruction in the negative sense of the term. So yes, the model shows how evolution may happen. It doesn't show how evolution will definitely happen. It's a potential. It's not a certainty. And as we evolve, we will have to keep going back and transcend and include what we've learned before as well, which means we will have to take into consideration all these other points that you're mentioning.
So the next topic is about how do we apply diamond model to Abrahamic traditions?
And that's.
Did you want to share your screen, Nish?
Yes, I did. Give me a moment. Sorry. All right, there we go. Right, now, mostly when I've spoken about the diamond model, I've tended to apply it to Eastern traditions. But I do think if it's really going to be a universal model, which is the hope, then it really has to apply to the Middle Eastern Abrahamic traditions as well. So here is one way in which that correspondence might actually take place. So by the Abrahamic traditions here, I'm talking about the three main traditions that claim to come from Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with the equivalent to what in the diamond model is referred to as wholeness. And this, with some qualifications that I'll come to, is what is referred to in these traditions simply as God. God is the ground of all being. God is the eternal, timeless reality or source that is, in some sense, the root cause of everything that exists. And this God or Godhead is referred to in these traditions as Yahweh in Judaism, as the Holy Trinity in Christianity, and as Allah in Islam. Now, God is seen as the creator of the world, which is a little bit different to the way in which wholeness has been used so far. Although in some of the more mystical traditions, such as Kabbalah in Judaism and Sufism in Islam, we do see interpretations or understandings of God that come a lot closer to this underlying wholeness, rather than this separate person who just creates the world. So in the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, says that the very first thing that God did is to create the heavens and the earth. So that very first verse is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that first split, whereby the one becomes the two, before it becomes the many, is what I've shown here, is that God creates on the left there the heavens, and on the right there the earth. In some very general sense, we could think of this as mind and matter, because heavens are the subtle realm, not very accessible to our senses, whereas earth is the gross realm accessible to our senses. So that primary dualism, that primary two-ness that God creates, or that in a more mystical sense emerges out of God, is this primary split between heavens and earth. Or in the more exoteric religion, it's simply God creating these as two separate realities. Now, creation, what I've called creation, which corresponds to multiplicity, in its original state, according to these traditions, and I'm drawing more now on Christianity, and I think there are probably very similarities in Judaism and Islam. In its original primordial state, creation was created good. It wasn't created with all these problems. It was created as something that is good, in harmony with what God intended. So in some sense, creation in the beginning, the Garden of Eden, I'm alluding to here, was heaven on earth. That combination of heavens and the earth together created this perfect creation in the beginning, this good creation in the beginning, the Garden of Eden, the multiplicity. Parts, not fragments. However, at some point, human beings, now this in Christianity is the story of Adam and Eve. At some point, creation rejected God. Human beings ate the apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil being a very primordial dualism. So when creation rebelled against God, when multiplicity forgot its underlying wholeness, creation fell into sin, multiplicity fell into fragmentation. And that entire process, whereby God creates the heavens and the earth, we have a beautiful creation to begin with, but then creation itself is damaged because human beings fall into sin by creation rejecting its God. We can refer to that entire story as the story of creation on the left there. However, the whole point of these traditions is to point a way back, whereby we can rediscover the goodness of creation, rediscover God. And that process on the right I'm referring to as the process of salvation. So here sin is somehow healed. Creation rediscovers its ground in God. And the ultimate non-dual state is what these traditions might refer to as paradise, where there is a non-dual relationship between God and creation, where God and creation will exist alongside each other in perfect harmony, the whole and the part. There's no dualism between them. And this is often seen in these traditions as some future historical happening when God is going to come and judge everybody and set everything right. The Messiah will return, Jesus will return. There's the day of judgment in Islam. So that paradise corresponds in these traditions, in this context, to God and creation being in perfect harmony, the whole and the part being in perfect harmony. And that process whereby we move towards creation, God, and eventually paradise, I'm referring to as salvation. Now, there's an extra dynamic in these traditions, which is we don't find so much in the East. And that is, even after we have creation and we have sin, we're not left entirely to our own devices to find our way back through salvation to God. God has a special revelation in these traditions. So you can see that vertical line in the middle there. God is communicating in some way to his creation. The whole leaves its footprints in the realm of multiplicity through revelation. And that these traditions would regard as scripture, the Torah, the Bible, the Quran. These are ways in which God has communicated with creation. These are hints that wholeness has left in the realm of multiplicity that would enable multiplicity to heal its fragmentation and find its way back to wholeness and eventually back to paradise. So that's a quick summary of how the diamond might be seen in the Abrahamic traditions.
Nish.
Yeah.
If
Hi.
I may.
Let me just
Hi.
stop the share briefly.
Oh, that's right. I really appreciate you putting creation as multiplicity. I think that is really kind of genius. And that out of well, I won't say anything more about that, but I'd love to. I'm going to think some more about that. And I'm just wondering, in terms of where you've put revelation, Can you speak some more about that? Because there's, you know, revelation as in the story in the Bible. There's revelation as in, oh, I've had sort of an insight. There's revealing something through a sensory experience. Is there anything more you would say as a nuance on that?
What I specifically mean by revelation in that context is the view or the belief in the Abrahamic traditions that God has spoken to human beings through his prophets. So there are specially chosen people in these traditions like Abraham and Moses and Jesus and the Prophet Muhammad who receive a revelation from God in a way that is not available to the rest of us in a way. They become mouthpieces of God in these traditions. And that's why we get the sacred books, which are effectively written by the prophets. In a more general sense, this is wholeness speaking through a particular vehicle for the benefit of multiplicity. That's not so obviously there in the Eastern traditions. It's there a little bit, but not in the same way. You tend to have mystics primarily in the Eastern traditions more than prophets that you see in the Middle Eastern traditions.
That clears it up for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the idea of prophethood is fascinating. And I think about how it was a very potent way for a message of wholeness that was revealed within a certain time for certain people that was digestible and even necessary for a group of people at that time. And how we don't really quite have prophets in that sense nowadays. So some would argue differently because there are people to proclaim to be some sort of prophet, but prophet in the monotheistic sense, and in the Islamic tradition, Muhammad is considered the seal of the prophets, which means there will be no prophets after him, which makes it difficult for Muslims to consider that anybody else would be capable of sharing a message. But I think in a way, we could think of it as prophethood in the way that we used to think of it is over. But perhaps what we actually have now is an opportunity to transmit all of us a kind of wisdom. But I think it's that evolution towards wholeness that allows all of us to consider that we could all be a channel of divine wisdom of some sort. Of course, if you say that to a traditional religious person, it will sound sacrilegious. And that's a kind of a tension right now, I think, between the old format of religion and the sort of new way of relating with spirituality. So
yeah, great point. I'll say two things in response to that. But great points. I think in a sense, scripture has taken the place of prophets in the monotheistic tradition. So whereas in the past, the prophets were the mouthpiece of these traditions, and they weren't really to be questioned because they were accepted as channels of God. And as in all these traditions now, the prophets that don't really exist anymore. Jesus was seen as, in a sense, the final prophet, the Prophet Muhammad. And I don't think Jews accept any real prophets in that sense anymore. However, all of these traditions have scriptures which are not to be questioned, in some sense, not to be questioned. They can be interpreted in different ways, but nobody's going to come along and say the Bible is rubbish. These are still seen as sacred revelations of some kind. So that human vehicle of revelation from whole to part that was there in the past, now in a sense the book has become that revelation from the whole to the part. And so these three religions are peoples of the book in that sense. The second point I wanted to make is that if you look at the circle that's there in the diamond model, you've got the whole manifesting as the part and revealing itself to the part. And then you've got the part through a process of what I'm calling salvation, rediscovering the whole. I would say the first part of that we can see in the prophetic tradition, but these are the prophets who manifest the wholeness through their messages to the parts. But now what we're being called to do, instead of waiting for more prophets, is to enter into that process of ascent ourselves and become mystics. So the need for prophets has been replaced by a need for mystics. We've moved from the age of prophets into the age of mysticism, which I think completes the circle, completes the diamond. Steve, hi.
Yeah, hi. Yeah. So I'm going to ask another question about Revelation, really asking the same question that the previous two questions have asked, but from a slightly different perspective again, and about on this topic of sort of concepts of time and the fact that the Abrahamic religions tend to have this kind of more linear sense of time, that we're returning to the Garden of Eden, or we're returning to heaven, or we're returning to unity or whatever, and that Revelation plays a role in shepherding us kind of on that journey, you know, and at various times kind of truth is revealed or in a new form or new complexity or whatever, whereas in the East, as we've discussed before, there's more this sort of circular sense of time that samsara will just go on forever, and it's only by exiting samsara altogether that you can achieve liberation or freedom or whatever. So it strikes me that within the Abrahamic, it's almost more like a return within creation almost, whereas in the other one, it's like almost an exit from creation in some sense. I know it's complex when you start talking about non-duality, but in some sense, it's an exit from that naive dwelling in creation. So, do you have any comments about that?
Yes. Yes, I think I generally agree with you. I mean, the Christian tradition is the tradition that I know the best of the three. In the Christian tradition, they might see things slightly differently. I think in the Christian tradition, at the end of time, we return to God, but then there is this new creation in which God and the world become one, and that's paradise. So the non-duality there will include both God and the world, but the world will be in a transfigured state because it's come into harmony with God. So this is, in some sense, it's more of a descending tradition, more than getting out of here and going back to God. That's just an intermediary step. You bring God back to the world and you transform creation. In the Eastern traditions, they have tended to be more ascending traditions. So the emphasis, more than transforming creation, has been about getting the hell out of here because creation is suffering. And we return to wholeness. And in many of the traditions of the East, we stay there, we don't come back. In the tantric traditions, in the non-dual traditions, we do come back in a sense, but it's still different from the Middle Eastern traditions, because even if we come back, creation isn't transformed literally. We just recognize it now as a manifestation of God. We even recognize suffering as a manifestation of God. So there's a radically non-dual perception, but that doesn't mean that matter itself changes. In the Middle Eastern tradition, specifically in Christianity I'm talking about here, there's actually the belief that at the end of time, it's not just a question of coming back and recognizing all of this as God, but matter is literally transfigured into a godlike substance. So I think in the Eastern traditions, even the final non-dual transformation is primarily epistemological. It's about how we know things, how we see things. Whereas in the Middle Eastern traditions, that final transformation is more ontological. Matter literally changes and becomes into a godlike substance. So I would say it's a difference of, in fact, that difference kind of mirrors the diamond model, because the greater emphasis in the East is a subjective transformation. It's a transformation of your perception radically. Whereas in the Middle East, and it's ultimately even an objective transformation. The world literally changes. God remakes the world.
I think within the Tibetan non-dual, you could maybe even say that the change in the epistemology eventually even then dissolves the ontology, basically. The ontology, yes.
Yeah, and you do get shades of that in the Eastern traditions with phenomenon like the rainbow body, for example, where ontology changes. But eventually, yes, the ontology will dissolve and there'll just be this pure radiance at the end of time in the Eastern traditions, yeah. So I think there's a different emphasis. I don't see them as contradicting. I see them as focusing on different aspects of the diamond to the exclusion of others. Michael.
Hey, Nish.
Hi.
I was struck by the transcendent right arrow in the diamond model is labeled evolution. In the Abrahamic is labeled salvation, which that feels totally makes sense. Different ways of thinking of a similar force. But in the scientific, it's destruction, which is like, what? Have any thought about that?
Yeah, I think in the scientific, I did think about whether that should be destruction or whether that should be also be evolution. The reason I went for destruction is because eventually in the scientific model, matter will return to energy. Matter is finite in its lifespan. And because of the law of entropy, everything's eventually going to dissolve and go back into energy. The way the diamond applied to science would accommodate what we would call evolution in the diamond applied to, say, the traditions, would be a kind of cyclical process within multiplicity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So multiplicity will become more and more complex.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a tension here between two almost opposing forces in the scientific model. You've got multiplicity trying to become more and more complex, which is, and rediscovering its own inherent wholeness through that process, which we could call evolution. And you've also got entropy, which is tending towards the opposite direction, which would be the arrow on the right going up. So there's almost a conflict between complexification, which is what development essentially is, and destruction, which is what, if entropy takes over, that's what would occur. Does that make sense? Some kind of sense?
Yeah, I think so. It raises new questions, but I don't want us to take too much time on this.
Okay, thank you.
What I'm appreciating is that you're moving beyond the cognitive bias against entropy, death, the feminine, the yin, however you want to describe what we're all ignoring, the elephant in the room. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, Veronica.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe dissolution would be a better word than destruction. I mean, I agree with Sally that we have to look at the yin and yang in our society, especially we don't want to look at death. Everything's all about life, life, life. And of course, we're moving towards beauty and life. We appreciate it, but we don't know how to look at the darkness. We don't know how to look at death. So I'm glad that you're bringing that in, but I wonder if dissolution would be less apocalyptic sounding, because destruction, I mean, when you use the example of the atomic bomb, there it made sense, but you need kind of specific examples. Otherwise, it just seems like destruction for nothing. But dissolution sounds like, okay, we're going back towards wholeness, because we, like the Legos coming together to form a building and Legos falling apart to go back into the box, kind of. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I mean, I think I used destruction there because I was trying to see it purely from the atheistic scientific materialist point of view in that particular version. And that's probably how the scientist would see it. He might not see it that we're all going back to wholeness as if that's a positive thing. The atheist scientific materialist would probably just say, well, this life is finite. It's all going to be destroyed. We just go back to energy. But dissolution is a really good term that I could also play with using there. Yeah.
Yeah.
The destruction sounds like
that doesn't
destroying,
feel,
not like sorry, Michael. Go ahead, Michael.
No, yeah, dissolution feels like a much more neutral and true to what's happening.
Okay, thank you. I'll definitely, I can definitely use that instead of destruction. Yeah, thank you. It also,
involution, Nish? Involution.
I mean, involution is a term I think that's more specific to the Eastern traditions. I mean, in that diamond model, which was the atheist scientific materialist model, I'm trying really hard to only use terms that would be acceptable to a scientist. So scientists probably wouldn't think in terms of involution. Dissolution is an interesting one because it kind of incorporates both destruction and also it could, if we widen the meaning of the term, incorporate some kind of evolution as well, because it's the opposite of illusion. So that's an interesting term. Involution, I have used that when I apply the diamond model to the Eastern traditions. I've almost invariably used involution there on the left, following like Aurobindo. Involution would be creation and evolution would be what I'm calling destruction or dissolution there. But I think the general point is that when I'm applying the diamond model to a specific context, I'm trying really hard to only use terminology that would be legitimate to people in that context. And that's the challenge here. It's we end up with terms that don't exactly correlate with one another, but kind of give the sense, the same kind of sense. Because I think the diamond it's a universal structure, but it does morph into slightly different shapes as we move it around different contexts. Thank you, Sally. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
I just wanted to echo your point you were saying about the atheistic scientific viewpoint, because obviously that is in some sense inherently nihilistic from a point of view of spirit or consciousness or whatever, and consciousness is then just an epiphenomenon which is dependent on a certain level of complexity. So if the complexity is destroyed and you go to sort of like, you know, high entropy state, then there's the sense there'll be no sentient life anymore, and in that sense it is a kind of destruction or dissolution or whatever. So that's right, but it's worth pointing out, I think, at this point that atheistic viewpoint isn't inherent to the scientific view. That's a kind of almost theology applied to the scientific view. Because at this point in our scientific knowledge, we have very little to say about consciousness. You know, and the few things we can say about it are quite troubling from a kind of materialist realist viewpoint. So, you know, and so some people are experimenting with ideas like pantheism or whatever, or that you know, that consciousness is a kind of another type of element that's in some sense distributed through the, you know, whatever. I mean, however they're approaching it, and then those are also kind of effectively theologies. But I think you know, a lot of the scientific or maybe scientistic community are coming from that kind of idea that our consciousness and all the things that we enjoy and prize about our existence are completely dependent on a certain level of complexity in the universe, which is enables our life to exist. And so I think they would see it as a kind of destruction and end of all that we value and cherish.
I mean, this is why in the diamond applied to the materialism, I put sentience as something that emerges as we complexify, coming down. And that would then also dissolve again as we move towards the greater simplicity of energy again at the end of time. Because I think, yeah, the dominant view, I think, in science still is consciousness as an epiphenomenon of material complexity. I think that's still the dominant view, which is very different to some of the spiritual traditions, of course, yes. Thank you.
How do you see this applying to current times, Nish? Because nowadays there is, especially among newer generation, there is almost sort of an aversion towards religion. So do you think that some of these insights from religion, is it going to phase out? But there are different directions it could go. It could phase out, or it could come back again with new interpretation. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that if we use the spiral dynamics model as a kind of guide to how evolution and development might go, it does seem to suggest that after we've gone through orange, which tends to be less religiously or spiritually inclined, there are orange forms of spirituality, but generally it tends to, the emphasis doesn't tend to be there in orange. As we move into green and especially into yellow, spirituality seems to return in a different form. we don't tend to return to the more belief-oriented, dogmatic religion of blue. But I think humans do have some kind of need for existential meaning that orange materialism sooner or later isn't going to fulfill. And they are going to be looking, and they're already looking, for deeper meaning to life, but they're not necessarily able to find it in traditional religions because orange thinking has kind of dismantled the possibility of going back to those kind of beliefs. So a new green, yellow spirituality would need to emerge. And I think that's already happening. Now that emergence could take place in completely new ways of thinking that have got nothing to do with the religions that have gone before. And to some degree, you get that with new spiritual teachers, with new age movements, for example. But I think there is also a place, and I think this is also happening, that people do return to the pre-rational spiritual traditions and find ways to reinterpret them in a green and yellow way. And I think if we're willing to be more flexible in our understanding of terminology, which in a way is what the diamond model is trying to encourage us to do, then that can be done. We can have reworked Christianity, reworked Islam, reworked Buddhism, Hinduism. And I think when that happens, the emphasis will be more on experience and transformation and less on belief and faith. So we'll be looking to the mystics more than to scriptures necessarily.
I have another thought before we move on to this next subject. Okay, so I'm reading Rupert Sheldrake's book called Science Set Free, and he basically shows how the Abrahamic religions basically birthed atheism, right? Because the very first scientists were devout Christians, and they believed in these certain things that they were taught from the church. And so that morphs into the secular atheistic. And it's really interesting the way Rupert mentions that our current science, I know that in your model, it's like all about observing and being really objective about reality. But the truth is, our current scientist is very blinded by values that they just hold. Ideology blinds them. So he's trying to convince scientists to open their eyes and actually measure gravity every day because it does change. So there's a bunch of really interesting things in there. But I think that having your two models sort of like show how someone can go from the Abrahamic traditions into the secular atheistic traditions might be an interesting kind of you know how the thing they used to do back 10, 20 years ago with like the pictures morphing over time. It was like such a cool trick. You could sort of have something like that to show how we got there and how basically we still hold on to these, like, this is the truth, even though we're still blinded. And so I just thought that might be an interesting extra step that you could bring in.
Yeah, thank you. What I actually do want to do, and maybe this will be the next kind of step in the development of the diamond model, is to show how it morphs through the different levels of spiral dynamics. So you'd have a beige diamond, a purple diamond, a red diamond. And so what you'd see there is you have these transformations, but the fundamental structure, whole, part, subject, object, remains like a universal all the way through. So then looking specifically at blue, orange, and green, we could see how the way we understood the universe at blue has now morphed into this more orange scientific materialist view. And that will morph again, and is already morphing even within science, to a more green diamond. But there are deep similarities between these as well as the differences. And I think the diamond and its two fundamental dualisms would bring out those deep similarities. And many of these terms can be seen to be different emphasis on the same kind of insight, but at different levels of development. Yeah.
Nish, I know this is early to ask you to name what lens you're using, but this is not a secular model. It's not a materialistic model. How would you is it panentheistic? How would you describe it?
You mean the diamond model in its original state prior to being applied to anything? Yeah, I mean, I would say that my orientation personally, which undoubtedly would have colored my creation of the model, because we always, that's unavoidable, is a kind of a non-dual panentheism. Yeah, so God is both transcendent and as the wholeness or the emptiness beyond the world, or the consciousness beyond the world, but God is also immanent in and as the world. And those two aspects of God are non-dual, are related in a non-dual fashion. Yeah.
I think this is a good time to move to the next subject, diamond model applications to collective unconscious. If you want to share your screen, Nish.
Yes, certainly. Okay, the collective unconscious. Now, this is another area which Suma and I have wanted to talk about for a while. So here is the diamond model applied to one possible way of exploring the whole idea of the collective unconscious. So when I'm describing these different aspects of the diamond, I'm also going to be referring to different levels of reality in the Hindu, Buddhist, Ken Wilber integral terminology as well, just to bring some kind of clarification to what I'm talking about. So at the level of wholeness here in this context of the collective unconscious, we actually basically have the collective unconscious, which is that sort of repository of all conscious experience, which is stored in some sense or held in some sense at this deeper, unmanifest, unconscious unity. And that corresponds roughly to what in the integral framework is referred to, Wilber refers to that as the low causal. In the traditions, we see this, for example, in Buddhism, this is referred to as the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness in which all conscious experiences and all archetypes which color our experiences are ultimately stored in some sense, but in a unified sense or a unified flavor. Now, as the collective unconscious starts to emerge into more manifest consciousness, again, I'm suggesting the first emergent is that fundamental self-contraction that takes place at the subtle realm that creates a distinction between the self and the other. So that's the first quality of differentiation that we see as the collective unconscious starts to emerge in a process that will eventually culminate with the emergence of the conscious mind. So that self-contraction, that subtle self-contraction, because I think it's in the subtle arena we first see that self-contraction, or we first experience that, is the first movement away from that pure unitive low causal state, which we can refer to as the collective unconscious. And then, as in the diamond model, the self-other dualism or distinction continues to proliferate its tendency to create parts. And we create now in the gross world of gross multiplicity, we create the conscious mind. And it's at the level of the conscious mind that we're able to perceive multiplicity. And that would be the gross world, the world of gross multiplicity. So the collective unconscious low causal manifests as the subtle self-contraction, the self-other dualism, which then goes on to manifest as the conscious mind, gross multiplicity. Now, what happens when our conscious mind runs away with itself in the sense that it loses any kind of real integrated relationship with its own deeper dimensions, its own deeper, subtle and causal dimensions. That, I think, is where we can start to fall into what we could call shadow, where various elements of what we need to have to have a healthy conscious mind, a healthy multiplicity, starts to become suppressed, repressed, projected. And that's where we can call that experience the experience of the shadow. So shadow there would correspond to fragmentation, conscious mind to multiplicity, self-other to subject and object, collective unconscious to wholeness. And that non-dual relationship between the collective unconscious and the conscious mind, when seen as a non-dual, non-separate source condition, is I'm calling that simply consciousness with no qualifications, which is the non-dual here in this context. We have a process of emergence whereby the collective unconscious becomes the conscious mind and potentially the shadow, and a process of enfoldment, or we could also call that integration. That would be another term I could use there, whereby the shadow is reintegrated into the conscious mind, and the conscious mind ultimately rediscovers its true source in the collective unconscious, which we could also call the self with a capital S, in the way depth psychology might refer to it as the self with a capital S. So that's a relatively quick look at how we might understand the notion of the collective unconscious in terms of the diamond model.
I've come off mute. I'm not sure if this is a good time for a question.
This is a great time for a question.
Thank you, Nish. The same question actually that came up for me every time I sort of look at the diamond model. But when we look at the realm of the multiplicity, I suppose to some extent, so seeing that there is a healthy relationship of the part to the whole, I suppose it seems to me very easy in some ways to be able to spot fragmentation, but I'm looking for some descriptive words of the multiplicity or in the gross multiplicity that describe sort of what it looks like, what it feels like, maybe some of what it might experience. As sort of a guide.
I would say that when we're talking about multiplicity as opposed to fragmentation in the context of personal psychological health, personal consciousness, I think we'd be looking at ideally the kind of conscious integration, either a healthy ego that has integrated its shadows, or going even deeper, an integrated centauric body mind, where the body and the mind are integrated into a unified, healthy, functioning whole. That's the kind of aim of different types of therapy. And I would hold that that's what these different therapeutic paths are aiming for. They're aiming for a healthy mind in a healthy body mind, where internal disjunctions between different aspects of the mind or between the body and the mind itself are healed as much as they possibly can be. That is how multiplicity would manifest in the context of an individual person. And I think it's Western therapy that has made enormous progress in actually helping us to move towards that, rather than any of the other Eastern approaches.
Would you mind just expanding on that real quick before we move on?
On the distinction between the Western and the Eastern approach?
Yeah, the way that you see that the Western approach to psychology has helped us.
I think that the Eastern approach has been very much focused on achieving wholeness. And its emphasis on multiplicity has been there only to the extent that multiplicity can help us to achieve wholeness. Multiplicity is not really an end in itself in the Eastern traditions. It's all about the whole in the Eastern traditions.
Yeah.
So even when we do yoga, now yoga can bring about a really healthy integrated body mind. But the traditional approach to yoga, and this is very different to the more modern approach, but the traditional approach to yoga is that it's just a means to an end. We bring the body into harmony so that we can awaken various chakras so that we can go on to realize the whole. In the Western approach, especially the approach in Western, different types of Western therapy. Now, I've done a lot of Gestalt therapy, for example, and I've also done a lot of what they call Rolfing. I don't know if you've heard of Rolfing, but basically these are not really concerned with at all, really, with realizing the transcendent. They're very much about making us as healthy as we can in the realm of multiplicity for the sake of multiplicity. So we develop the healthiest body-mind integration we can, either through working through the mind and going into the body, like in Gestalt, or working through Rolf with the body and going into the mind, like in Rolfing, not so that we can transcend, but so that we can make the best of our life here and live the most healthy, integrated life here. And I think that's been more the emphasis in the West. The emphasis in the East has been, well, the body is just a means to an end. It's just a means through which I can realize something great. Sally, does what I'm talking make any sense? You're the therapist here.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense, Nish. And what I'm enjoying is that you looked at Eastern, Middle Eastern, and now you've clarified Western. So there's like these three approaches, actually, which is interesting. And when you look at the word shadow, or you've used that word in several ways, how we're fractured. So that shadow, which is the specialty of therapies, bringing integration, and the new models like spiral dynamics comes out of the West, and great contribution. So these things working together still fit into the model beautifully. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Nish, can you give examples of how collective unconscious comes to awareness?
Yeah, I think what we would want to consider is, why is the collective unconscious not in our awareness? And I think the reason is because we're doing something to block it. Because the natural state of affairs is a non-dual relationship, and a dynamic non-dual relationship between the collective unconscious and the conscious mind. So what is it that we're actually doing that is stopping that natural state of affairs from manifesting? And my suggestion is it's actually that middle part of the diamond model, which is the subject-object divide. It's that self-contraction in which we're engaging moment to moment that is blocking out that collective unconscious from coming through and informing us, informing everything we think, speak, and do. So the way to rediscover the collective unconscious and find and at least open up that possibility for it to act through us, and in fact even realize that that collective unconscious is our true self in some sense, our big mind. Whereas what we normally call the ego is just little mind, small mind, is to work on loosening and transcending that self-contraction. And I think there are both Western and Eastern ways of doing that. They both approach it. There are different approaches, but there are, I think, approaches in both cultures to start to address going beyond the self-contraction. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Steve.
Hi, Nish. Sorry, I wanted to ask just about the collective unconscious, because I've obviously come across it in the context of the Alaya Vijnana. The thing that strikes me both in the Buddhist context and also on your diagram is that it's there as a kind of an entity, but it's before the self, other, divide or split.
Mhm.
So you're in this kind of metaphysical state where entities shouldn't really exist. There are no things at that point. And
Yeah.
yet, say in the Buddhist context, they talk about these karmic seeds or whatever.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'll throw in a little speculation, which is kind of where my mind's been playing, but is around action versus entity, or movement versus appearance, or whatever. And I wonder, and this is my own kind of feeling into it, but I wonder whether that collective unconsciousness or alive jnana is more a kind of a movement that's swirling around, that things that arise out of, rather than seeds, or however you want to call those entities. You know, but I thought just throw that out there quite speculatively.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, again, two things I'll say. The distinction between, there is a distinction between the low causal and the high causal in the integral model. And there are different versions of that across the traditions. So, you know, we could look at the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition. They have different ways of making that differentiation. But the simplest way of understanding it, I think, is that the low causal is unity and the high causal is emptiness. So what I'm suggesting is that the collective unconscious is not emptiness, but it is unity. It's unity in difference. So there is a unity, but it's not a unity that's empty of things. It's a unity that contains the seeds for the possibility of things. So it's that fundamental, you may have come across this term, it's a bindu. It's the source point out of which everything emerges. And within that source point are contained the repository of everything that's happened in the past in the realm of multiplicity, which is constantly being fed back into that source. And as for your second point about it's more of a movement than an entity, I mean, that's exactly the argument of David Bohm. So David Bohm's implicate order or hollow movement would correspond roughly with this bindu, or this low causal collective unconscious. And David Bohm very much describes it in terms of a movement, hence the term hollow movement. And in fact, the entities that arise out of that self, other, multiplicity, fragmentation are actually a sedimentation within that movement. So actually, where the entities, it's paradoxical, what we call entities are actually the result of less movement. And as we move to the collective unconscious, in a way, we're moving towards that primordial process out of which these different things and events emerge and solidify.
I'd love to speak a little into that, if you don't mind, Nish. The movement and entities, to me, implies relationship. So when we're talking about suffering, it's about the quality of the relationship between the parts and the whole. That's where the potential for suffering or love exists. And so in your models, and this is the question you asked about, where does the therapeutic model fit in? You've described sin, desire, shadow, fragmentation. In therapeutic talk, we might talk about the false self, or as Bette talked about, the personality, the frontal images. There's this movement that Campbell talked about of the hero's journey into separation and the return. So there's archetypical language for this relationship, the restoration of right relationship as well. The heroine's journey, the return of the prodigal. It's mythological as well. I'd love you to speak into that, because to me, this is the core work of embodiment, is the restoration of right relationship.
So, yeah, I agree with you that, I mean, I'll use a slightly different term, but healthiness or wholeness comes from a right relationship between the parts and the whole, and also between the parts and other parts. But the ground for that relationship between different parts is in that intuitive apprehension of their underlying wholeness. This is why ultimately non-duality, in some sense of the term, which is a relationship, a healthy relationship between the whole and the part, is what will ultimately save us, if anything is going to. Because that's what's going to truly address the root cause of suffering, which is this fragmentation between the parts, or between the whole and the parts. As for the hero's journey, that's an excellent thing to bring in there. As a mythological motif, I would say the hero's journey in this way of looking at things is the journey of the true self. The true self is the only hero. Who we really are in our deepest essence, which is the causal self. That is the hero that embarks on this hero's or heroine's journey of involution and evolution. It does so through the medium of lots of different apparent separate selves. So the true self manifests itself through all these millions and billions of sentient beings. And then all of those apparently separate beings are on a journey to go through this arc, the hero's arc, and go through this journey of suffering, overcoming suffering, and rediscovering its true original point as the true self. So there's only one hero, heroine, although there seems to us to be billions of heroes and heroines. So we're all on the same journey of the same true self, ultimately. And if you can really not just get that intellectually, but if you can really feel that, I had an experience, probably a silly experience, but I was sitting in Coventry where I studied a long time ago, and I was actually first meditating and getting into all this stuff, and there was a cat, that used to wander around campus, and I was sitting there just looking at this cat, and just for a moment it just became obvious to me that it's the same self that's looking out through my eyes to the cat as is looking out through the cat's eyes back to me. It's that same true self, which is the one and only primordial hero that's looking out through everybody's eyes at each other and challenging each other to rediscover the true self at the end of the hero's journey.
So Nish, your models are so exquisite describing this journey. And to me, you've described the what and the how. And I'd love you to share with us what your intuition is of the why. Why?
So why does this happen at all? I mean, metaphorically, I would say that, and this is pure metaphor, because what we're talking about goes way beyond our conceptual formulations now. That basically the true self wants to engage in this game of hide and seek with itself. Consciousness wants to know itself as object in order to play this game of hide and seek, or the other way of putting it is to experience what it is to love, because you have to have two to love. You can't have just one to love. So consciousness, in order to experience love, engages on this hero's journey, and which includes that path of return that we're all now hopefully on to rediscover our true identity as heroine. And why should we as separate people engage in this? Because the alternative is just to, well, there's so many different answers to that. But the negative answer would be, the negatively based answer would be to reduce and get rid of suffering. Because there's so much suffering in this world, and without addressing the root of that, not only in the world, but in our personal lives, without addressing the real root of that, we're just going to continue to drown more and more in this swamp of suffering. The positive reason, but the positive based reason, is because that rediscovery of wholeness and non-duality is offering us everything that we could possibly want in its ultimate form. All the things that we are constantly looking for through our ordinary pursuits. In a way, those are just diversionary compensation projects for what we really want. What the Spice Girls would say, what you really, really want, is to rediscover that wholeness, which is who you really are. Because that's what we, without realizing it, that's what we really desire, beneath all the other desires. And I promise never to quote the Spice Girls again in any talk that I ever give.
Oh,
So this is a
darn.
kind of a recognition of the thing having a relationship with itself through us.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Through us, the true self engages in this hero and heroine's journey through us for its own experience of love and play, and for our apparently separate beings that we are to re-experience that deepest inner desire that's already been planted in us because of who we already really are. What we long for the most is what we already really are. That's
Okay. Yes. I all of this is extremely fascinating. So I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian Calvinistic church, and my father is a pastor. He's supposedly retired, but he's still preaching. So the thing that he was continually dr- uh, pounding into us children was that God is personal. It's a personal God. And that's something that, even though I'm no longer following that faith anymore, that's in my brain somewhere. And then I was just at this bhakti yoga thing last weekend, sitting at the feet of this guru, and he basically gave a 60-minute lecture about the individual, about the personality, about how all of us have to be as individual as possible because that's who we are. And so I'm seeing a really big divide
Mhm.
between this idea of a personal God who then creates individuals who are not part of some whole. They're very separate. They're not, I mean, in the Christian, if I ask my father, are we all just part of God? I mean, he would say, no, you're an individual soul that's a separate entity from God.
Mhm.
Even though, yes, God is in through all of us. And like it would go on and on in some kind of single hand clapping discussion. But this bhakti yoga guy, I asked him, I said, is the universe evolving? And he said, no, that doesn't make any sense. The universe is a stale, static thing, and all these individual souls are just discovering themselves over and over. And so I don't know if I'm just lost here or if they're
Mhm.
really, these people do not believe that there is one universe that created us all and we're all just rediscovering ourselves
Mhm.
all the time. They believe that we are all, individuals. So if you could enlighten us on, are they just not seeing it that we really are just all the universe? All right, I'll stop there.
Yeah, right. My view is that there's no absolute correct answer as opposed to answers that are wrong. These are all different perspectives on the unspeakable. So, and these different approaches to what is God, what is the universe, what's the individual, they find their root in different interpretations of different types of mystical experience. So if somebody has there's a type of mystical experience that you could call a theistic mystical experience, where you see God as separate from you and you experience God as separate. There is a valid mystical experience where that experience happens. You can see that in Christian mysticism, you can see that in Bhakti Yoga. Based on that experience, when that experience is interpreted, what you end up with is this kind of theistic Bhakti view of the world. There is another type of mystical experience that actually goes even deeper, where that separation or that dualism between God and the world dissolves and there's unity. And people who have that experience come back and talk about that experience more in terms of what we've been talking today, which is the true self loses itself in all of us and goes back. So all of these different worldviews are essentially different stages in the waking up process being interpreted at different stages in the growing up process. So that's That's why you have all these different views, and they're all right within the context of the experience and the level of development that the person is speaking from. But if you look at evolution, some mystical experiences do transcend and include others. And as we know from spiral dynamics, some levels of development do transcend and include others. So if you want the full picture, it has to be that picture that transcends and includes all these other pictures. And I don't think the Bhakti view and the Christian view does that. They simply have to look at what we're talking about today and just say, well, that's just wrong. Whereas we don't have to say that. We can say, well, what they're saying is actually quite right at an earlier stage. So if we use that principle of transcend and include as the principle through which we discover what's the bigger and larger truth. In Hinduism, this is known as subration. One view comes along and it includes the previous view, but gives you a bit more. Then another view comes along and includes that view, but gives you a bit more. Then if we want the most complete view that's available to us at this time, we have to have that view that includes all the other views as best as we can, rather than a view that doesn't have to look at any view and say, well, you're just wrong. A view that includes every other view as a subset of itself. And that, I think, you do get that in the non-dual evolutionary view. The non-dual evolutionary view has that capacity at this stage in history to be able to transcend and include every other view, including the Bhakti view and your dad's view. But they can't do that in reverse. So we could argue that this is the bigger picture. So what I'm trying to do is just to present the biggest picture that we can present. And then different people's views, personal, impersonal, individual, blah, blah, are just focusing and shining the torch on different aspects of that huge big picture.
Thank you, Nish.
Thank you. Does that answer your question to some degree?
It answers mine because I think I'm more in the pantheistic point of view, probably very similar to you, which is why I probably am very attracted to these models. But I know that if I put my father's hat on, he would just be like, you guys are just running around.
We're talking
circles.
nonsense. Yeah, we're just talking
Right, exactly.
rubbish,
And I really try to engage with this guru and try to like maybe help him think a little bigger, but it also didn't go anywhere.
I mean, at the end of the day, people, and that includes all of us here, including me, it's not possible for us to think or conceive, understand beyond the level of development that we've reached. That's just the limitation of human beings. Yeah. So we're not going to be able to convert everyone to this view of thinking if we just sort of talk to them long enough, because everybody has a limit beyond which, but that is their universal discourse. They're not going to be able to go beyond that. And if some people I was reading Aurobindo, who's one of the most highly evolved mystics that ever lived, and I was reading some of his descriptions of what he calls like the overman and the supramental transformation. And I was sitting there thinking, what the F are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense at all. So if we talk about something that really is radically beyond what we're capable of understanding at our stage of development, it's not going to, we're just going to not be able to understand it. And the human response is usually just to say, well, that's nonsense.
Are there any other questions before we move on? The next topic, Nish, it's the East-West culture divide and the left-right brain divide. If you can expand on that.
Okay, thank you. So many easy questions today, great. Okay, so I'll give a brief overview of one possible way of looking at this, and it's just one possible way of looking at it. So I'm not saying this is the correct way or the only way of looking at it. But one of the things, again, I've been discussing with Suma in the past is there a way to understand why the Eastern approach and I'm talking very archetypally now because obviously there is interplay and intersection. But in archetypal terms, is there a fundamental difference in approach between the Eastern approach to life and the Western approach to life? Because East and West seem to be quite different in the way they approach life. So I'll give a very unforgivably brief and general description of what I think are the archetypal Eastern and Western approaches to life. So the Eastern approach in their religious, spiritual life anyway, has tended to be that life is suffering. The first noble truth of Buddhism. Everything is dukkha. Life here is unsatisfactory. It's temporary. You're never going to really get fulfillment. Everyone you love is going to die. You're going to die. You know, this isn't a great place to be. That's the essential Eastern approach. And because of that, and this is really exemplified in the story of the Buddha, who lived this sheltered life, and then he saw these old age and death and disease and poverty, and his life in the palace became meaningless after that, and he had to go and search for truth. So if that deep insight comes that life is fundamentally suffering, then the purpose of life has to be to get out of here. Because if life is inherently suffering, what we want is freedom from this cycle of birth and death. Because the East has tended to believe in reincarnation. You keep coming back again and again and again. Every time you suffer, you might suffer even more next time or less next time. Even if you go to some beautiful, subtle heaven, there's still going to be subtle suffering there. The only way to be free of suffering is to be free from the cycle of birth and death. And the way to do that is through engaging in this mystical path. Devotion, mystical experience, submission to the divine. This is the way to be free of suffering. We orient ourselves to higher knowledge, to finding the meaning of existence, the purpose of existence. And to a large extent, we don't worry too much about worldly pursuits because they're temporary, superficial, ultimately pointless distractions. This is the traditional Eastern view. So to a large extent, we suppress or give very little importance to worldly pursuits. What's important is liberation. The Western approach, especially since the Renaissance, the last 500 years or so, has been quite different. The archetypal Western approach, particularly in the modern world, is that life is an opportunity for fulfillment and even for perfection. Life is about body-based experiences. I am the body, and I want to have these amazing, fulfilling experiences where I pleasurize and fulfill the body. Also, true knowledge comes from what the body can observe. Scientific, empirical knowledge. What can I see through my senses and interpret through my reason? And since I am the body, and I want to make the best of life, my individual freedom is important. I should be free as a body, as a free thinker, to live my life the way that I want to live it. And nature is something that I can control. It's not part of me. It's different to me. It's something that I can control for my own benefit and fulfillment through the development of science, technology, worldly comforts, and so on. And the traditional spiritual pursuits that we see in the East, and to some degree we might have even seen in the West in a different form prior to the Renaissance, such as devotion to God, mystical experience, submission to the divine, have tended to be suppressed. These are not mainstream pursuits in the modern West at all, really. So my suggestion, and it's again very, very general terms, is that this archetypal split in the human race, if you like, between the Eastern and the Western approach tends to be a manifestation, perhaps, of the dominance of the left and the right side of the brain. So the left side of the brain, which is the rational, logical, rational side, has tended to be more the emphasis of the Western approach, whereas the right side of the brain, which is the more intuitive side, which probably more interested and concerned with wholeness and connection than with multiplicity, has tended to be the domain of emphasis of the archetypal Eastern view. Another way of putting it is that The Western world is more concerned with descent. We want to bring good things down into the world, whereas the East, even in the Western traditions, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Middle Eastern, Western traditions, it's been more about transforming creation, bringing God down here. And in some sense, the scientific enterprise, it might not be a great surprise that came out of cultures that had these Middle Eastern Abrahamic beliefs. Whereas the Eastern approach has tended to be about ascent. This world, multiplicity is suffering, let's ascend and return to the whole. The parts aren't that important. What both of these approaches have in common is that in their own ways, they're both driven by the ego at root. Whereas the West wants to fulfill the ego, get everything that will make the ego happy, the East wants to escape the ego. There's a real sense of escapism in some of these more transcendent-oriented traditions. When you have Theravada Buddhism or Jainism or Advaita Vedanta, you always get that sense, well, yeah, I mean, their analysis of the world may be correct to some degree, but isn't there also a sense of escapism, just going and sitting in the forest and meditating and starving yourself to death? Isn't there a more integrated way of living in this world than just doing that? So in the context of the brain, my suggestion is that if we wanted to develop what we could call a global brain, which would be a non-duality of the left and right sides of the brain, an integration of left and right, that would require integrating the best of what the East has to offer with the best of what the West has to offer. And that would be a way of manifesting non-duality, not only in the context of the brain, but also in the context of a life strategy. So how would we do this? So specifics, I would say we want to be, and this is my own personal reason that drives me to do all of this, we want to integrate the Eastern Enlightenment with the Western Enlightenment. We want to integrate the Eastern, ideally Eastern Tantric, ideally, view of what it is to truly realize wholeness and non-duality with the Western Enlightenment, which is what it is to truly fulfill ourselves as far as we can as individuals as well, whole and part, Eastern Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment. So let me elaborate a little bit on what I mean by those two types of enlightenment. So the Western Enlightenment, what I'm talking about here is really what kind of began with the Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and was rediscovered and developed in sort of 1500 Florence and so on. The emphasis on individual freedom, the emphasis on the separation of the church and the state, the development of science, technology, human rights, democracy, freedom. The Eastern Enlightenment is the Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist approach to life. Life is suffering, submission to the divine, realize your true identity as consciousness. So is it possible to integrate these two in some way? And my suggested framework for how we can do that would be that we need to recognize two types of evolution, two very different types of evolution that East and West represent. The evolution that I think where the Western world has excelled is the type of evolution we describe using models like spiral dynamics. This is what we could call growing up. We grow up. We move from more limited ways of thinking to more multi-perspectival ways of thinking, from red to blue to orange to green to yellow, first, second, third, fourth, fifth person. That is something that the West has really excelled at, much more than the East, certainly so far historically. So that's one type of evolution that I think gives us greater and greater potential for individual and collective fulfillment and freedom in the manifest world. There's another type of evolution that we could call waking up. And waking up would be to work our way through deeper and deeper forms of mystical awakening. Typically, these are described in the traditions as in 3 or 4 stages. You've got nature mysticism, where you see that you're actually one with the gross world. You've got deity mysticism, where you have an experience of God as separate from you. What I was talking to Bet earlier, God as separate from you, that's a kind of a subtle mysticism. You have formless mysticism, where you realize emptiness. This is the traditional aim of Buddhism and Vedanta. And then you have non-dual mysticism, where you realize the oneness of all 3 realms, gross, subtle, and causal. Now, when it comes to this kind of evolution, the waking up evolution, the East has been probably far more successful than the West. There's been a huge number of really deeply enlightened traditions in the East, India, Tibet, China, Japan, and so on, probably more so than in the West. So East and West have both excelled in 2 different types of evolution. Waking up in the East, which I think might be more connected with the right brain, growing up in the West, which might have its origins more in the left brain. One way that we could bring about this integration of East and West would be to integrate these 2 forms of evolution to the best of our capacity. And what I think that would mean is we wake up as far as we can, and then we interpret, understand, express that waking up with the highest level of growing up that we're capable of doing. The East has all the techniques to help you to wake up as far as possible. The West has all the techniques and knowledge to help you to grow up as far as possible. So experience, Eastern, interpretation and understanding of that experience, expressing and manifesting that experience in daily life and in society, Western. So let's have a look quickly at what would happen if we had just one without the other. If you have a lot of waking up, but not very much growing up, I think we've seen that in some of the ancient traditions. We'll have people realizing very high states of mystical illumination, causal, non-dual, but the way they might interpret that would be very pre-rational. So in the traditional, in the ancient traditions of India, Tibet, China, Japan, we tend to have quite red and blue, spiral dynamics, red and blue interpretations. So quite early developmental interpretations of very high experiences. Imagine if we did it the other way around, have loads of growing up, but no waking up. Then what you would have is that you would be evolving to these higher and higher extraordinary levels of interpretation and multi-perspective taking, but you'd never go beyond the manifest world, which means you'll never go beyond this realm of suffering. So waking up without growing up, you're escaping the world and coming up with quite childish interpretations of what you're doing. Growing up without waking up, you're running after shadows, more and more complex and beautiful shadows. Or put it in terms of a dream. This is just another metaphor. You're at night having a dream. The East is not about improving the dream. It's about waking up. The West has been not about waking up, but about making the dream as good a dream as you can. Integration of West and East would, I think, be very much about waking up from the dream, but also making the dream as pleasant as you can. And that, I think, is one way that you could possibly integrate East and West. Now, I think we've seen movements in this direction a little bit in Greek culture, a little bit in Chinese culture. But I think that's the way forward for human beings, I think, if we're going to integrate these different parts of our brain. And there is other aspects like cleaning up and showing up as well. But I think I'm just focusing on these 2 main ones now, just to emphasize this archetypal difference between East and West. So there you go, how to fix the world in 10 minutes.
I have a quick question. So this is very, I love, by the way, this is like my favorite part of this whole thing. And you did talk about this on the Spiral Dynamics live integral Zoom thing that we have recorded on YouTube also. Maybe we can put a link to that. So I think question I have is just going back to very practical, right? I'm a yoga teacher. Is there something I can teach my students every class that can help them integrate all of the West with all of the East and then come out of the thing being this incredible, enlightened human being who can get out there and like fix the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a lot to do in a 1 hour yoga session. Yeah, I think different aspects of yoga can address both the waking up and the growing up aspects of existence. Yes. So insofar as yoga can help to take you beyond body consciousness, which is the object of, say, the meditational aspects of yoga, it can help you to wake up. Insofar as it can help you to develop a healthy functioning body, that can help you in your growing up aspect, because it will move you towards the more body-mind integration, which you see at green and yellow in terms of growing up. And there's also a cognitive aspect to this. There's also the aspect of challenging people to develop more progressive, multi-perspectival ways of interpreting what they're experiencing as well. But yes, I think yoga, if you take all 8 aspects of the Patanjali's 8-fold yoga, Ashtanga yoga, you will, I mean, that entire composite path, which begins with things like right view and right intention and right speech, you would be very much dealing with the growing up aspect there. And then the later ones, like right contemplation and right meditation, would be dealing more with the waking up aspects. So it would be possible to use that integrated yoga 8-fold path to address both waking up and growing up, I think, yes.
I'd love to jump in here. I just love what you're doing, and I want to just bring in Veronica's pointing out of we're moving from prophecy to multiple voices expressing the same beauty that we're seeing. And this is coming through the collective unconscious in various voices. So when we look at Ian McGilchrist's work, how he's verifying the 2 hemispheres working in different ways of being, and you're discussing the hemispheres of the globe, and we're understanding what it takes to integrate, how the East has established mastery over states and the West over stages.
Yes, exactly.
And how we bring the understanding of states and stages together. We're going to have such a great map. I've been talking about this as integral Taoism, and there's so many people talking about the neurology of this now, the internal tantric marriage within us, what we need to accomplish. And you've brought this beautiful map of the principles. Other people are bringing the neurology of it. Others are bringing the grand narrative of integration. And it's all coming through us together at the same time. And I'm loving this. But I think your map in particular is foundational to this understanding.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think that, putting it again in slightly poetic terms, the true self is moving to quite a more integrated stage now in our historical development through the medium of all of us that are working in this kind of area. Yeah, it's potentially the next stage in the hero's journey. Yeah, that next stage towards integration. And given the world we live in, it doesn't make sense anymore to have a Western world and an Eastern world. Those distinctions have to be subrated with a higher integration now, given just the global world we live in.
In some scenarios, it seems to be going in the opposite direction, Nish. Especially I see this in the tech world. I feel like sometimes rigid thought processes or thinking in a certain way, it's becoming more and more narrow-minded, where if you don't explain something in a logical and rational way, you are not taken seriously. And their definition of logical and rationality, it can be quite strict sometimes because it's very binary. So how do you like, because I see that becoming more and going in that direction where it's becoming more and more binary. So how do you integrate that if for people who work in those kind of industries?
I think that if we look at the different stages of growing up, say through the spiral dynamics model, then the technology world is still very much entrenched in orange. That's where it started. And I would say it's probably at the level of people working, say, at software development or that kind of industry. It's still very much an orange-based pursuit. And I think there is this strange phenomenon that as higher stages emerge in the collective, each of the levels that isn't ready to transform can often morph into more extreme versions of itself to try to maintain its own identity. So when orange sees green and yellow, which it doesn't really understand, but it just sees them as these weird, wacky things, orange contracts even further and becomes even more orange. Same with blue and every level. But I think what we're talking about here is still going to be manifesting in a very relatively small minority of people. I think you need to be sort of high green, early yellow to really grasp what we're discussing, the kind of things we're discussing today. And that isn't anywhere near mainstream yet. I think in the mainstream world, we're still seeing blue becoming more blue, orange becoming more orange, and even green morphing into very unhealthy forms of green, as all of these different parts of society are trying desperately to hold on to their own identities. They can become more extreme versions of themselves. I think you see that in every, I mean, fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism in its most extreme forms, in many ways has actually become worse since the advent of modernity. Because it sees modernity as a huge threat, and so it has to strengthen its own identity by becoming a mean version of itself. Same with orange. When orange sees all these green things happening which threatens orange, it becomes a mean version of itself. And even green, I think, has become quite an unhealthy version of itself. So I think that's the problem. It's a very complex picture. And just because these things that we're talking about today is still happening at the cutting edge, there's a long way to go before that starts to filter down into some of the earlier levels, I think. So we've got our work cut out if this is what we want to do, because most people are not going to see this or be very much interested in this. I think this is still quite a minority approach, although that is changing. That is slowly changing.
Nish, I'd love to ask you about how we come back full circle when we think about the unnameable, but all we've done here is try to name it. And how we always can only see, and this is left brain, right brain thing again, either a map or a metaphor of the thing itself, and how maps and metaphors are vital, but it's part of the subject-object split. And to remember that at the core of this, it's unnameable, and just honoring that for a moment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all models exist at the realm of multiplicity, including the models I'm talking about today. And we absolutely have to have maps and models if we want to understand and interpret what we've experienced. If we don't, then that experience is of no use. We've had this amazing experience, then you just forget about it and carry on doing whatever you do. But if we want to actually understand that experience and bring some of the value of that experience into our lives, the only way to do that is through a process of interpretation and understanding, which means we have to develop maps and models. But when we're doing that, we have to always bear in mind, always, that the finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. And so we hold our models lightly. So the diamond model is not the way it is. The diamond model is just this poor schmuck's attempt to draw a picture to the best of his limited ability. And in 10 years from now, somebody will come along with a far better model, and the diamond model will be thrown away. And that's how we evolve. We hold our models very lightly. They're just our very limited glimpses of that unspeakable great one. And nothing more. But they are useful in the domain in which they arise. They have a use. As long as we don't absolutize them, because when we absolutize them, then we become fundamentalists, which is the very thing we're trying to avoid here. So yeah, we use them intelligently, but at the end of the day, they're no substitute for having the experience itself. That's the most important thing. Take up a spiritual practice and realize.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of messages here. I think this has been a very insightful conversation, Nish, and everyone's questions, they were brilliant. I feel like we were able to go in a lot more deeper because of this group. But I want to be mindful about everyone's time. Is there anything else, like any other insights you want? And everyone is welcome to share before we wrap up as like a closing thought for our conversation today.
I just want to appreciate the container that Nish and Suma created by inviting this. I mean, I think it was a very interesting discussion. So thank you both very much for that.
Thank you very much, Michael. You're all very welcome. And I want to thank Suma for making this whole discussion possible.
I want to thank all of you. This group was brilliant. Like I felt like I didn't have to do anything. You all were like, I feel like that's what integral awareness looks like.
The integral the we starts to speak, not just the I.
Yes. Yeah, I really enjoyed everyone's presence over here, and there were so many insights that came through, and hopefully this is like a trigger for us to integrate all these segregate paths in our own psychology.
Yes.
Nish, I want you to share a closing thought and maybe like a brief summary for this conversation, and then we can wrap up.
Okay, thank you. I mean, first of all, I'll thank all of you for coming, a full turnout. I really appreciate you sparing your time on a Sunday to do this. Closing thought. The essence of everything that I think I'm trying to get across here, and Suma will agree with me, I'm sure, is that let's look for the wholeness behind the fragmentation. That's what this is all ultimately about. Lives and the world and our individual lives and our psyches. There's so much fragmentation. If we can contribute even that little bit towards understanding what wholeness might look like and feel like, and work towards embodying that in our own lives, even very slightly, then we've made the best contribution that we can to ourselves and to others. So that would be my closing thought.
Thank you very much.
Could I just say, Nish, one more quick thing?
Please.
We looked at states and stages, and what I'm loving about your work is structure. So there's like another element here, which is I'm appreciating.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to post everyone's bio in the description, and I'll send out a link to everyone. Thank you again so much. This was beautiful. I really enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you, Nish.
Thank you, Nish. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.